Thank you, everyone. As I was preparing for this talk, I realized that it could just as well have been subtitled, "Why Social Science is Bullshit." It's not, of course. We need social science. It's the thing that probably most directly impacts our quality, well, not our quality, that most directly impacts how we relate to each other, how our institutions relate to us, of all the sciences. But it's got some huge limitations. And for a community that is empirically minded and evidence-based like ours, we need to be aware of those limitations. We need to equip ourselves with the tools for working around those limitations. And we need to consume information derived from social science research cautiously. In the physical sciences, the gold standard of enough to take seriously is generally 1 part in 10 to the 6th. That's where you start thinking there might really be something there. You know, if we measured gravity and it differed from the predicted value by, 1 part in, well, if we could narrow down what the true value of gravity had to be to, 6 decimal places, and it differed from the theoretical value, we'd start worrying. If it differs by, if we only narrow it down to within 5 decimal places, could be measurement error. You don't stress about it too much. There's some evidence that maybe there's a 5th force, but so far the best possible, the best available studies have only shown that it might be off, within a smaller amount than that. So, another couple of generations of refinement will actually have something that we start looking at. In the social sciences, the gold standard of not just there might be something worth looking at, but let's treat this as fact and start making public policy decisions on it, is 1 chance in 20. What we call p less than 0.05. This is a little bit dry and theoretical, and I apologize for that. We'll get to some of the juicy examples in a little bit. But what you need to know about p less than 0.05 is that it means there's a 5% chance that this result is just random circumstance. That's just a statistical fluke. There is a 5% chance that this study is flat out wrong. You might think, why does social science choose such a ridiculously low standard of evidence? And the answer is that people are a lot more variable and unpredictable and imprecise than, fundamental particles or galaxies or chemical reactions averaged across 10 to the 26th particles. So it's really hard to get better measurements than that. Think about how many times you'd have to flip a coin before you were absolutely certain it was absolutely fair. If you flip it 10 million times, you're going to get something really, 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 really close to 50% heads and tails on a fair coin. But if you flip it 100 times, you're pretty likely to get 48 heads and 52 tails, 49 heads and 51 tails. Not all that likely to get exactly split down the middle every time. So to be certain that it's a really fair coin, you need a very, very, very big sample size. In physics, you can have sample sizes in the, well, like I said, 10 to the 26th. A mole of oxygen atoms is only, 16 grams, something like that? It's tiny. And it has 10 to the 26th oxygen atoms in it. So it's not hard to get stupidly big numbers. There are 200 billion stars in the Milky Way, and there are something like 100 billion galaxies in the observable universe. There's lots and lots and lots of big numbers. People are hard to research. A study that talks to 1,000 people, just sends a survey to 1,000 people, is expensive. Much less brings someone into a clinical setting and does an experiment on them. And of course, there's ethical considerations. You can't just experiment on people on your own whim. You have to get them to agree that being experimented on sounds like fun to them. You have to compensate them. You have to pay them. You don't have to pay, carbon atoms to participate in a carbon dating project. You don't have to check their ethical consent. So we accept a much lower standard of evidence. We accept a 1 in 20 chance of being completely wrong as a good standard of evidence for a study. But then we treat it like fact. We act as though it were just plain true. There was a really fascinating study a couple years back now. Eva has the link, I'll get it from her later. But we have a study that set out to replicate 60-some of the most foundational experimental results in the fields of psychology and sociology. They picked, they based on like number of times the paper was cited, and they found 60-ish things that were just really core to how we model human minds and human interactions. And they tried to replicate them. Now you might expect, because it's not just that these studies are foundational, it's that they have been the foundation of a field. So there's been lots and lots of work done in that field. There's been lots of things that should have caught any problems. More than half of the attempts to replicate failed. More than half. Now, we would have expected 1 in 20 to fail because p less than 0.05, sometimes you're just not going to get the accurate result. But more than half failing, that's way outside what would be expected. That suggests that for many of those, they're not true. But they're the foundation of entire branches of psychology and sociology, which is actually kind of worrisome to me. Now, again, we would expect to see about 1 in 20 being unable to be replicated. But that's partly because they aren't just one study. They're one study and all of the studies that followed it. How is it possible that it hasn't been, that these errors haven't been caught earlier? And that's because there are systemic and cognitive biases that predispose both our research and ourselves to error. For example, there's publication bias. If I'm trying to prove that a medicine works, one of the really great ways to prove a medicine works is to keep doing studies until I get one that shows that it works, which will happen 1 time in 20 on average, even if it does nothing at all. And then send that study in to the FDA and say, please approve my medicine. Here's proof that it works. You'd think this doesn't actually happen. But when a team of scientists got from the FDA all of these studies that had been submitted, this isn't just the ones that that were pre-filtered by the medication companies. They got all of the studies that had been submitted to the FDA by the makers of Prozac. And again, I have a link for this. And they did a cross-study analysis of the results. And it turns out that Prozac is not clinically significant at all, except for people at the very extreme ends of the severity. The very extreme, most severe depression, Prozac has a small clinically significant effect. As a side note here, the researchers had to submit a Freedom of Information Act request to the FDA to get access to those studies. That's a profound institutional bias against acknowledging that they screwed up, to be blunt. But it doesn't even have to be deliberate. If somebody tries to get funding for a study to replicate a classic result in the field, well, people go, that's a terrible use of money. We already know that's true. We already have a study, a really good study showing it's true. So why should we spend money replicating it? It's just going to get the same result. People don't get tenure for publishing studies saying that, sure enough, there's a bystander effect. Okay, yeah, we know that. We've seen that. And even if you get funding for a study like that, journals only have so many pages to publish articles in. Big journals aren't going to want to dedicate 2 or 3 of those pages to a study saying, yep, sure enough, we reinvented the wheel, that still rolls. So a lot of research doesn't get done. And there's also there's a conservative sense at play. If I do a study and it shows that actually this foundational research was wrong, the journals are going to be really skeptical about publishing that. They're like, well, we need more evidence to see that. And they keep doing that. None of the studies get published that show that the study was wrong. A lot of these are things that we as individuals can't do anything about. We can't actually change the way journals respond to articles, to studies, or the way that studies get funded. And the good news is that has improved over the last several decades as people realized these problems. Now medication trials have to be pre-registered with a registry that says, this is the study we're doing, this is the measurement we're taking, this is the hypothesis that we're trying to prove or disprove, and we will publish the results, whatever they are. And that cuts down a lot on pre-selection by the drug companies. I couldn't find the source where I read this, but I read about the initial approval of Prozac. And the drug company did on the order of 40 studies to get 2 of them that showed a statistical benefit from Prozac, and didn't submit the 38 that didn't. And that's in addition to the problems with clinical significance. It took them roughly 40 attempts to get statistical significance, and they succeeded twice, which is exactly what you'd expect from random chance. And again, because pre-registration of studies wasn't required, no one caught them at it for a long time. Which says that one of the things that we as individuals can do is be skeptical, more skeptical of research results the older they are. Because the older they are, the more likely they are to have biased the field in a certain direction. And the older they are, the less they have been subjected to the precautionary measures that are now becoming the standard in fields like medicine. The second problem you'll run into is bias on the part of the researchers. There is a study with n, number of participants, equals 1,000, which is a really good number, honestly. N equals 1,000 and p less than 0.05, proving that intercessory prayer, someone else praying for you, works for cardiac illness, whether or not you know it's happening. Double-blinded, controlled study, n equals 1,000, p less than 0.05, prayer works. Have I just, supported something spiritualist, theological, etc. from the pulpit? I have not. Because that study is complete bunk. Now, for one thing, it would be complete bunk even if it were fully legit, because it's got a 1 in 20 chance of being wrong. It's got, I mean, you roll, how many people have a D20, right? D&D fans represent. You roll your D20. If it comes up 1, prayer works, proven, scientifically proven. Not really very convincing. But the second part is, they had some 30 measures in that study of things like length of hospital stay and people who died. This is in a cardiac unit. And then they had one metric that was their own synthesized metric, which used terms like good, intermediate, and bad rather than days of hospital stay. The 30 different measures, none of them showed a statistically significant effect of intercessory prayer. Their vague and synthesized measure, that's the one that showed a small statistically significant effect of intercessory prayer. Also, that metric was taken from a previous study that had shown a effect for intercessory prayer, and it's not in any way a standard or validated metric. So if you measure enough different, the surprising thing is that none of the 30 showed a significant effect. You'd actually expect one of those 30 to show a significant effect just by random chance. So they got unlucky on that. There have been other studies showing that intercessory prayer works where they just cherry picked. They just put enough measures in and didn't publish the data on the fact that they had that many measures. There are a lot of other flaws with that study, and I have links for those as well. For example, they didn't get consent from the people who were being prayed for, even though in their paper, they acknowledged that in a prior study, 12% of the people they asked refused to be prayed for on personal, moral, or philosophical grounds. So it's also completely unethical research according to the Nuremberg standards. Just putting that out there. And then there's not just bias, there's out and out fraud. One of the foundational studies in psychology, one of these things you'd really like to replicate, is Phil Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment. And the Stanford Prison Experiment purported to show that if you take perfectly ordinary, psychologically healthy college undergrads, and you randomly assign some of them to the roles of prisoner and some to the roles of guard, and you have them act out a mock prison for a couple of weeks, the guards will naturally become brutal and sadistic, and the prisoners will naturally become cowed and easily humiliated and controlled, and so on. It's fraud. The published study is full of lies. For example, the guards were specifically coached in how to treat the prisoners. Not disclosed. It was claimed that it was completely spontaneous. No, they were told, call them these names, threaten them, make them stand against the wall, do these things. And the guards fought back. They argued, like, no, we don't want to do this. This is really creepy and weird. And it was published as the guards enthusiastically tormented the prisoners all on their own initiative. It's just plain fraud. And it took 40 years for that to be discovered. In the interim, a lot of people made conclusions and public policy and did research based on that finding, which was, again, fraudulent. Now, you might wonder why so many people were so eager to latch onto this study and publish it and believe it. And the answer, honestly, is that it was part of the research being done post-World War II to try to understand the behavior of the guards in the prison camps in Nazi Germany and its conquered territories. Now, there's some really valuable research that came out of that. The Milgram shock experiments, Stanley Milgram's experiments on people's willingness to commit acts they consider morally atrocious on the command of authority figures. Absolutely robust, well done, thoroughly replicated, also really great, really fascinating research, and horrifying and bone-chilling. If you're not familiar with the Milgram shock experiments, I encourage you to Google them and read up on them, but preferably where someone can give you a hug afterward, because they're pretty rough. Turns out that 2/3 of people will push a button that they believe will kill someone in another room if they're told to by an authority figure hard enough. Just say, no, you have to push the button. Guy in a lab coat says, you have to push the button. You have no choice. The experiment must continue. You have no choice. You must go on. And 2/3 of people will push a button that they believe is killing someone, an innocent person. So that was the environment in which the Stanford Prison Experiment was published. People desperately trying to understand how people who otherwise appeared to be decent, normal people could do these atrocities. And so people didn't apply their normal critical thinking to it. They were swayed by emotion. And one of the things we as individuals can be careful of when we are evaluating a study is, does it make us feel something intense? If it makes us feel validated, vindicated, superior, like we were right all along, like we can relax now because now it's proven, any of those things can cause us to give more weight to a study result than it warrants. Again, roll the D20. If it comes up a 1, prayer works. But also things that infuriate us, things that just seem shocking. An experimental result that's completely unexpected. Who would have ever thought that? We're more likely to pay attention to it, to share it with other people. It's more likely to come to our attention because other people are sharing it. Even if they're sharing it to go, oh my God, I can't believe what the study has shown. Shocking studies are more likely to get published. They're more likely to get viral in the media. They're more likely to be brought to our attention by our friends. They're more likely to take up space in our heads, and they're more likely to shape our expectations and our actions. So if a study seems really unexpected and startling, remember that it may not actually be true. It's got a 1 in 20 chance of just being wrong. And it's also disproportionately likely to get published, disproportionately likely to get shared, disproportionately likely to be talked about. Each of us, I follow science news, more than most people. And I probably end up reading even a non-scientific layperson's summary of 0.1%, maybe 0.01%, 1 in 10,000 of the actual published articles. There are a lot of studies published every month in a lot of journals. And it's incredibly unlikely that I'm getting an unbiased random selection of them passing my eyes. So remember that what you're seeing is a heavily biased, heavily filtered on multiple levels selection from studies, 1 in 20 of which is completely false. I've said that a lot. I'm kind of hammering on that point because it's so unintuitive to us, especially to people who are familiar with the hard sciences, the standards of proof. How do we know that quantum mechanics is true? Because it's been tested exhaustively at a ridiculous range of situations and energy levels and different types of particles. The standard model is really robust. It's got a lot of predictive value and still got people trying to poke holes in it every day. It's got $20 billion accelerators trying to prove it's wrong every day. We're accustomed to that being the standard of truth. When we say the scientific method, that's what we have in mind. But in the social sciences, which directly impact our lives, roll the D20. It comes up a 1, that fact is false. And as shown by the attempt to replicate the foundational studies, it's actually more like 50 or 60% that are false, flat out wrong. Stop and think about that for a minute. More than half of the things that we base our social policy on, that shape our research paths, that define what the null hypothesis is, we'll get to that in a minute, more than half of them just aren't true. They're just not actually verified at all. I want to mention a little bit about the null hypothesis, because again, this is a sort of somewhat arcane bit of science that's really important to how we think about studies. The null hypothesis is what everyone assumes is true that you're trying to prove something different from. It's the invisible hypothesis in literally every study. Because you've got an experimental hypothesis. I think that people are nicer when they've just been to an atheist church. Right? So you want to prove, actually you want to try to disprove the idea that in the day after an atheist church meeting, people are more likely to be charitable. Well, the unstated base assumption, the null hypothesis, is people are consistently charitable, right? Well, it might be that, people aren't consistently charitable. They're just more charitable on Sundays. It might be that people who think that they're being studied act more charitable if they care about charity or philosophy or ethics, which disproportionately causes people to attend atheist churches. But that null hypothesis is always there in every study. There's the thing that we assume to be true if we disprove the results. And that null hypothesis is based on the accepted wisdom, the state of knowledge, which is based on these studies, half of which couldn't be replicated. When one of these 1 in 20 studies comes out that's wrong, it's likely to shape the interpretation of every following study. Because we assume that if the experimental hypothesis is false, then the null hypothesis is true. Well, we don't actually know that. There might be one study that had a really wrong random chance result, but every study that follows it, that has it implicitly as the null hypothesis, is going to appear to strengthen that belief, when actually it does nothing of the sort. Because there are a million ways to be wrong from some starting point, and only a few that move you closer to a true understanding of the underlying reality. And every time you go every time you cancel out, everything you mark off as, no, this isn't actually true, one of those million ways to be wrong, you'll end up unconsciously reinforcing your belief that the current null hypothesis is true, but it doesn't actually provide evidence for that. So it's really hard to change one of these things. You actually have to have a number of successful studies that move the entire needle in a direction different than the original study. And even then, getting funding to test the original study, to test that conclusion, to try to replicate it, is really hard. We don't get many things to debunk, to correct these errors, even though 1 in 20 of them at least is wrong. Because we've taken actions as a scientific community to compensate for these factors, things like pre-registering studies, things like a greater awareness of publication bias, we have improved this. So probably of studies done now, only about a quarter of them, let's say, are simply false. We know it's going to be at least 1 in 20, but since there's still bias of various sorts, maybe 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 is false. Whereas you go back 40 years when we didn't have those institutional precautions, and more than half of them are false. So basically, the thing I hope you'll take away from this is that the standards of proof in the social sciences are on the order of 5 orders of magnitude or 6 orders of magnitude less than the standards of proof in the physical sciences. They're a 10,000th or 100,000th as reliable. That's point 1. Point 2 is 1 in 2, more than 50% of the foundational studies in psychology and sociology cannot be replicated. 3 is at least 1 in 20 of the studies we're doing now is flat out false. You can't do anything about it. It's just, they're just going to be wrong. And this applies, by the way, also to a lot of medicine, not just to psychology, but to physiological medicine. Because again, it's really hard to do studies on large numbers of people. It's really expensive to study people. Actually, very briefly, sorry to break my own wrap up here, knee surgery doesn't work. There are a lot of surgeries done to fix tears in the ACL and the PCL, the big ligaments that hold your knee stable front to back. And it turns out that those surgeries are exactly as effective as a mock surgery, where you follow all of the forms of a surgery, but you only make little incisions in the skin with less pain and less recovery time, and they're just as effective. The effectiveness of knee surgeries, specifically the effectiveness of ligament repair for the ACL and PCL, is entirely placebo effect. Surgeries just turn out to be a really amazingly good placebo. But it took decades, and people still have those surgeries, even though they have been proven with multiple studies, well replicated, to not be any better than mock surgeries. People still have them. So 1 in 20 results at least is wrong, and we have reason to believe that a lot more than 1 in 20 is wrong, even with the precautions we now take as a scientific community. So when you read a shocking, and the fourth point is, our emotions have a lot more to do with whether we even see a study and with whether we believe it when we see it than we think they do. Shock sells, emotion sells, sectarianism, even scientific sectarianism, sells. A study that is in any way emotionally evocative is going to be more likely to be seen and believed. If something seems too good to be true, it probably is, as they say. If you see a study that confirms a long-held belief of yours, immediately be suspicious. Double check. Read the actual study. And the final point is, read the actual study. I've seen headlines that claim things literally the opposite of what the study actually claimed and showed. I've seen headlines that completely got it wrong. It was like, it had nothing to do with what the study had showed. If you go back to, so you don't need to read necessarily the whole thing, but read the abstract and read the discussion and the conclusion, because those are generally written in terms you can make sense of, even if you aren't a science nerd. And they'll tell you so much more about things like how big was the study? What standard of proof did it use? How robust is the conclusion? And if you're planning to change your behavior based on a study, and you don't have heavy science nerd tendencies, talk to someone who does. I volunteer as tribute. If you have a study that you're like, this just seems a bit too good to be true, or this just seems a bit too wrong, and you don't have the science chops ready to hand to figure out for yourself why, send me a link and say, hey, what's up with this study? Because I enjoy going out and finding out what's going on inside the study. And I'm sure you have other friends who are science nerds. Use their abilities rather than uncritically believing things. Because we hear the words double-blinded controlled, large double-blinded controlled study proves, and we believe it. We put that in our mental map of truth. And 1 in 20 of them is flat wrong. And way more than 1 in 20 is the victim of publication bias, funding bias, attention bias, institutional suspicion, out-and-out fraud, etc. So be very careful when consuming the results of social science, because they're not even close to as good as we think they are. In closing, I'd like to thank Eva Karlstrom, Robin Glenn, and Fjorleaf for their assistance in finding the resources that I will be linking on the when this talk is published and on the church Facebook. So a lot of the facts that back this up are courtesy of their help. Thanks a lot.